Jasmine sat quietly beside the rolling hospital bed, her heart still beating louder than usual. Vanessa was lying back now, a blanket pulled up to her chest, her eyes drifting between the ceiling and the nurse who hadn't quite left. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, casting a pale glow over the corner of the ER they'd been moved to. Despite the buzz of monitors and distant voices, there was something still about the space between them, like time had slowed down just enough to let them both feel it. That odd familiarity neither could quite explain. Jasmine didn't say anything at first. She just studied Vanessa's face when she thought the girl wouldn't notice. But Vanessa did. She caught Jasmine's eyes, held them for a moment, then looked away again, almost embarrassed. A few seconds later, she turned back and gave a tired, curious smile. There was something about the way Vanessa tilted her head, the same way Jasmine did when she was trying to make sense of something strange. It wasn't just the bone structure or the shape of the eyes anymore, it was in the little things. The micro-expressions, the rhythm of their gestures, the unspoken understanding in the silence. Jasmine felt it like an echo in her chest. She didn't need a test to tell her anymore. She just knew. Vanessa cleared her throat softly, still wincing slightly from the pain. She asked if they'd met before. Jasmine hesitated, her thoughts flickering to the DNA alert still fresh in her phone, to the memories of growing up in a family that loved her but always made her feel like she'd come from somewhere else. She'd asked herself for years why she felt like a puzzle piece in the wrong box, even when things were fine. And now, sitting here, looking at someone who might share not just her DNA but her questions, her history, her absence, everything inside her said this wasn't coincidence. She introduced herself, kept her voice light, even though her palms were sweating. Vanessa smiled and gave her name back, her tone warm despite the pain. They exchanged a few more polite sentences, nothing out of the ordinary. Jasmine asked how long she'd had the symptoms, when the pain had started, whether she had eaten anything unusual. The usual triage checklist. But her heart wasn't in the questions. It was in every glance, every flicker of recognition she couldn't push away. Vanessa answered patiently, her gaze never fully leaving Jasmine's face. When Jasmine noted down the symptoms and turned away briefly to update the chart, Vanessa finally asked if Jasmine had ever been told she looked like someone else. Jasmine froze for a second, then turned back slowly. She said she had once or twice, but not in a way that ever felt this real. Vanessa laughed gently, even though it hurt to do so, and admitted the same. Her laugh was soft, but it reached her eyes, and Jasmine felt it like a thread tightening between them. It wasn't just familiarity anymore, it was recognition. Still unsure how to proceed, Jasmine asked if Vanessa had ever taken a DNA test. The question hung in the air, oddly personal but somehow appropriate. Vanessa nodded, saying she had signed up for one out of curiosity, and only just received a match notification earlier that day. Her voice was shaky, and she said the notification arrived right before the pain hit. She hadn't had time to look at it properly. Jasmine could feel her heartbeat in her throat now. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened the app again. Same match. Same name. She showed it to Vanessa, who leaned in, squinting at the screen. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then Vanessa whispered something barely audible. Jasmine nodded slowly. Everything started to make sense in a way that left her a little breathless. Two girls. Same age. Same town. Same DNA. Same questions. Raised by different families who told them very little about their origins. It was too much to be chance. Jasmine felt a mixture of awe and anger rising in her chest. Who had decided to keep them apart? Why had no one said anything? But she pushed those thoughts down for now. In this moment, she wasn't just a nurse and Vanessa wasn't just a patient. They were something else, something ancient and profound, born from the same beginning but shaped by separate lives. Jasmine didn't know what came next, but as they looked at each other again, this time with no filters, no distractions, she knew something had changed. A doorway had opened, and neither of them would walk through it alone. The next day, Jasmine and Vanessa found themselves sitting across from each other in the hospital cafeteria, both exhausted but wide awake in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. The kidney stone that had brought Vanessa in had settled, and the ER doctor had scheduled her for further imaging later in the week. But that was barely a footnote now. The real reason they couldn't stop talking was the match. The message. The impossible pull that said they weren't just strangers. They were something much deeper. Possibly sisters. Maybe even twins. The idea still felt surreal. They compared notes, stories, fragments of the past that never made sense until now. Jasmine had grown up in a quiet, upper-middle-class neighborhood. Her adoptive parents were kind, supportive, but not the type to talk much about the past. All she ever knew was that she had been left at a church during a snowstorm. There was a small envelope with her name, birth date, and a note from the adoption agency. That was it. She had asked about siblings before, but the answers were always vague. It was like there was a piece missing, and she was told not to look too closely. Vanessa's story wasn't much different. She too had been adopted by white parents who had loved her, but who carried a quiet, uncomfortable energy whenever questions about her biological roots came up. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 17, leaving her with a few photos and a locked file from their lawyer. She had only recently gained access to it, and most of the contents were legal documents. But one letter stood out. It said she had been left at a church across town from the one Jasmine mentioned. Same day. Same year. Same weather. They stared at each other across their coffee cups, letting that sink in. The coincidences were piling up too fast. Two black girls. Both adopted by white families. Left on the same night. In the same city. Jasmine dug through her phone and found the envelope she'd taken a photo of years ago. She passed the image across the table. Vanessa stared at the handwriting. It looked eerily similar to one of the forms she had. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled up a scan of her own record. They compared the way the dates were written, the loops in the letters, even the fading ink. There were no names of parents. No mention of siblings. Just vague references to a child in good health. Jasmine felt something harden in her chest. She had spent years wondering where she came from, never once imagining that her mirror image was living less than an hour away, walking around with the same questions, the same sense of being incomplete. Vanessa looked at her with a softness that only sisters, lost and then found, could share. They decided together. They needed answers. Not guesses. Not maybes. But the truth. The real story behind what happened to them 20 years ago. Jasmine remembered the name of the adoption agency written on the old letter, Whitebridge Services. Vanessa had never heard of it, but she agreed it was the best place to start. That afternoon, they drove there together. The building was small and tucked between a pharmacy and a post office, a quiet place with peeling paint and a faded sign. Inside, the waiting area was empty except for a single receptionist who gave them a tight smile when they explained what they were looking for. They asked to see records. The receptionist shook her head. Confidentiality. Legal limits. Too much time had passed. Jasmine and Vanessa didn't argue. They simply asked to speak to someone who'd been working there 20 years ago. After some hesitation, the receptionist went into a back office and returned with an elderly woman named Miss Thorne. Her eyes were sharp, and her posture carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. She listened carefully as they explained who they were and what they had discovered. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, she admitted she remembered something. 2 baby girls. Same day. Same confusion. And yes, the same biological parents. Miss Thorne looked around the room as if checking for unseen eyes, then whispered that there had been pressure from a powerful family. The biological father had insisted the twins be separated. No record of multiple births. No connection. He wanted no questions asked. And the agency, fearing lawsuits and public fallout, had agreed. Vanessa looked like the floor had dropped beneath her. Jasmine felt her throat tighten. They weren't just given away, they were erased. And the people who did it had names. Faces. A history that Jasmine and Vanessa were finally ready to face. The car ride home was quiet, but their minds weren't. Jasmine drove, one hand on the wheel and the other clenched tight in her lap. Vanessa stared out the window, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, her thoughts tumbling over each other. The revelation from Miss Thorne had struck them like a cold wind, clear, cutting, undeniable. They were twins. The kind of truth that should have brought joy, reunion, healing. But this one came wrapped in lies, sealed behind decades of silence. They hadn't just been placed for adoption, they'd been split apart on purpose. Back at Jasmine's apartment, they sat at the kitchen table in a mess of manila folders, printed emails, old documents, and birth records. Vanessa had dug up her adoption papers from her lawyer's file, and Jasmine added everything she had, copies of her envelope, a scribbled address, even a blurry church bulletin from that week in winter. The more they compared, the more disturbing the similarities became. Both were left within an hour of each other. Both churches had submitted anonymous notes. Both sets of adoptive parents had been told they were only children, found abandoned, no known siblings. It was like their lives had been scripted by someone desperate to keep them apart. Vanessa found it especially strange that her file included one page Jasmine's didn't, a placement report stating she was found at Grace Chapel. Jasmine had always been told she was left at St. Luke's across town. The locations were nearly 10 miles apart. 2 churches. 1 night. 2 babies. It felt coordinated. Not like a random act of desperation, but a decision. One made with intention. Jasmine couldn't shake the image of 2 infants, bundled up against the cold, placed gently on separate steps while snow fell quietly in the dark. Who did that? Who looks at 2 babies and says, let's pretend they don't belong together? Their questions kept circling back to the same people. Mark and Elaine Whitmore, the couple Miss Thorne had whispered about like they were ghosts from another era. Wealthy. Influential. Determined to erase a choice they couldn't bear to live with. It sounded unbelievable, but there was too much evidence now to ignore. Vanessa's heart pounded every time she said the names out loud. Jasmine felt a strange tightness in her chest too. Not just anger, but something deeper. A grief she hadn't had the words for before. They hadn't just lost their parents. They had lost each other. 20 years of birthdays, holidays, late-night talks, fights, laughter. All of it stolen. They searched online for the Whitmores. It wasn't hard. An old property record listed a large estate just outside the city limits. Gated, private, pristine. Public photos showed the couple at charity galas, ribbon cuttings, smiling stiffly for the cameras. Nothing about them screamed scandal. But behind the polished appearances, Jasmine and Vanessa knew there was a crack running through everything. And they were ready to shine a light through it. They debated for hours whether to go. What would they say? What if the Whitmores denied everything? What if they slammed the door in their faces? But Jasmine reminded Vanessa of something they both needed to hear. They didn't need permission. They weren't looking for hugs or apologies. They were looking for truth. And no one had the right to keep it from them anymore. The next morning, they got in the car and drove. The neighborhood was lined with manicured hedges and quiet driveways. The Whitmore house stood at the end of a long lane, surrounded by tall trees and silence. It was beautiful, but Jasmine felt no awe. Just wait. Vanessa reached over and squeezed her hand. They stepped out together, walked up the stone path, and rang the bell. When the door opened, a man with graying hair and sharp eyes stood before them. He looked tired, like someone who had rehearsed peace for too long. As he stared at their faces, the color drained from his. His lips parted, but no words came. Then footsteps sounded behind him, and a woman emerged. Elegant, controlled, but pale. Her eyes locked on them and didn't move. Jasmine could see the truth in the way her shoulders tensed. They didn't need to ask if these were the Whitmores. They already knew. What they were about to hear might change everything. But Jasmine and Vanessa had made peace with one fact already. This was their story now. And they were done letting someone else write it for them. The silence in the Whitmore home was different from any silence Jasmine and Vanessa had known. It wasn't the quiet of peace or comfort. It was the kind that came just before a storm. They sat across from their birth parents in a formal living room that looked like it had been lifted from a magazine. Everything was in place. Nothing was out of order. Except for the truth, which was about to unravel it all. Mark Whitmore sat stiffly on the edge of a velvet armchair, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. Elaine, in a cream-colored blouse that looked barely worn, perched beside him with her lips pressed together like she was holding back a dam of emotion. Jasmine and Vanessa, both calm on the surface, were anything but. Their eyes flicked from the heavy furniture to the people who had once shared their DNA, and who had then chosen to pretend they didn't exist. Jasmine began slowly, her voice even but unflinching. She explained how they'd found each other, the DNA match, the matching birth records, the trail that had led them all the way to Whitebridge Services. Mark and Elaine didn't interrupt. They just listened, though Mark winced more than once, and Elaine blinked hard, clearly trying to keep tears at bay. When Jasmine reached the part about Miss Thorne and the sealed files, something shifted. Elaine inhaled sharply, like she'd been holding her breath for 20 years. Finally, Mark spoke. His voice was hoarse, smaller than Jasmine had imagined it would be. He admitted they had tried for years to have a child, and when it failed, they turned to a fertility clinic. The clinic told them the embryo came from white donors. That's what they were promised. But when the babies were born, it was clear something had been different. The twins had darker skin, textured hair, undeniable signs of black heritage. He paused, as if hoping someone else would pick up the story. Elaine continued. She described how their families had responded with judgment, even threats. Her parents warned them they'd be disowned. Mark's side reacted with shock, anger, shame. They were terrified of losing their social standing, their families, their sense of control. So in the haze of panic, they made a choice. They told the hospital they wouldn't take the babies. They walked away. But what Jasmine and Vanessa didn't know, what made everything even more heartbreaking, was what happened next. The hospital staff, realizing the birth had resulted in twins, contacted the adoption agency to find suitable homes. That's when Mark returned, furious, demanding that the girls be kept apart. He didn't want people wondering why a white couple had given up 2 black children. He didn't want questions. He didn't want anyone tracing anything back to them. So he insisted. And Whitebridge, afraid of the legal consequences and the family's influence, agreed. The girls were quietly separated, each given to a different adoptive family. No connection. No record. Nothing that could be linked together. Vanessa's fists were clenched in her lap. Jasmine sat motionless, absorbing every word, but her mind raced with anger and disbelief. They hadn't just been abandoned, they'd been erased, split apart by the same people who were supposed to protect them. Elaine's voice cracked as she tried to explain. She said they thought it would be better that way, that the girls would get a fresh start, that they'd grow up safe. But even as she spoke, it was clear she didn't believe her own excuses anymore. Jasmine looked directly at them and asked the question that had been burning inside her since the moment they opened the door. Why didn't you at least let us grow up together? Even if you couldn't raise us, why make sure we never knew each other? Mark had no answer. He lowered his head into his hands. Elaine whispered that they'd told themselves it would all disappear, that with enough time, the guilt would fade. But it hadn't. It had followed them every day. Every holiday. Every photo frame missing faces. The room was heavy with emotion, but there were no raised voices. Only the ache of what had been lost. Jasmine and Vanessa weren't looking for redemption, or even reconciliation. They just wanted the truth. And now that they had it, they weren't sure what to feel. Relief, fury, grief. As they stood to leave, Elaine asked if there was anything they could do now to make things right. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment before speaking. Maybe not right away. Maybe never. But this, telling the truth, finally, was a start. Then they turned and walked out of the house that had once buried their existence, leaving behind the people who let fear decide their fate, and carrying with them something far more powerful than shame, clarity. As the heavy front door of the Whitmore estate clicked shut behind them, Jasmine and Vanessa walked in silence. The air outside was crisp, the sky overcast, and a soft breeze rustled the trees that lined the driveway. They didn't speak until they reached the car, but even then, neither of them was in a rush to get in. They just stood there, side by side, processing everything that had just unfolded. It was one thing to imagine the people who had abandoned you. It was another to sit across from them and hear them say the words aloud. Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice low and tight. She said she felt like she'd been holding her breath for 20 years and finally exhaled, only to taste bitterness. Jasmine nodded slowly, still staring at the house. The whole time they were inside, Part of her had hoped for some kind of emotional release, a moment of recognition, maybe even remorse that felt real. But what they got instead was a carefully unpacked confession, coated in regret but wrapped in fear. Yes, the Whitmores had told the truth. But they had done it with trembling hands, like people more afraid of their past being exposed than of the pain they caused. Back inside that perfectly decorated home, Jasmine had asked one final question before standing up to leave. "What would you have done if we never showed up?" Elaine had looked down, her fingers twisting a napkin in her lap. Mark hadn't answered at all. That silence told them everything. They hadn't been searching. They hadn't been waiting. They had been hoping the past stayed buried. Vanessa had found her voice in that moment. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked her birth parents in the eye and told them that what they did wasn't just about shame, it was about fear. And that fear cost two little girls 2 decades of memories, of birthdays, of stories, of each other. Jasmine added that they didn't come looking for love or acceptance. They came because they deserved to know the truth. And that even if the truth hurt, it was still better than the silence. Elaine had tried to reach out, whispering that they were sorry, that if they could go back, they would do things differently. But Jasmine knew too well that going back wasn't an option. She had grown up feeling like a stranger in her own life, always sensing a missing piece but never knowing what it was. Vanessa said she used to look in the mirror and wonder who she looked like, why her laugh felt like someone else's. Now she had her answer, and it wasn't the Whitmores. It was Jasmine. The sisters stood quietly outside, the estate behind them fading into the background. There was no dramatic ending, no cinematic embrace, no final twist. Just the heavy truth laid bare. And strangely, that was enough. They didn't feel victorious. But they did feel free. Free from wondering. Free from hoping someone would eventually show up with answers. Because now, they had them. And even though those answers were painful, they gave Jasmine and Vanessa something they had never had before: control over their own story. As they drove away, the tension in the car slowly began to ease. Vanessa leaned back in her seat, looking out at the trees rushing past the window. She said that maybe someday they'd feel ready to talk again. Not for closure, but for understanding. Jasmine agreed, though she wasn't sure when, or if, that day would come. What mattered most was that they had each other now. And that was more than either of them had ever thought possible. That night, they didn't go back to their separate apartments. They picked up takeout, curled up on Jasmine's couch, and scrolled through baby name meanings, wondering what their names would have been if they'd been raised together. They laughed more than they expected to. Not because everything was okay, but because something inside had shifted. The ache was still there, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. And sometimes, sharing the ache is the first step toward healing. The next morning came quietly. The sun filtered through Jasmine's living room window, casting a soft glow on the blanket where Vanessa had fallen asleep on the couch. Jasmine was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. Her thoughts were stuck somewhere between anger and understanding, frustration and clarity. It wasn't just what the Whitmores had said, it was what they hadn't. The pauses, the deflections, the excuses wrapped in polished words. They had confessed, yes, but every word had been laced with fear, not courage. When Vanessa woke up, she didn't say anything for a while. She just sat beside Jasmine, pulled the blanket tighter, and stared at the same spot on the floor. There was no need to fill the silence. They both knew what was sitting between them, the weight of choices they never got to make, and the lives they could have shared but didn't. Jasmine finally broke the silence. She said she couldn't stop hearing Elaine's voice in her head, trembling as she tried to explain that their families wouldn't accept them, that the color of their skin had somehow made them unworthy of being raised by the very people who brought them into this world. Vanessa shook her head, her eyes burning. She said she had imagined many things over the years: drug use, poverty, tragedy, but never this. Never the idea that two educated, well-off adults looked at their own babies and saw shame instead of love. That kind of abandonment didn't come from chaos. It came from cowardice. Jasmine nodded, feeling the sting of that truth. It hurt more because it had been so deliberate. They talked about everything: the separation, the lies, the echo of loneliness they had both carried for so long. Vanessa said she remembered being the only black girl in her school, constantly being asked if she was adopted, being told she was so lucky to have white parents, as if her existence was a gift from someone else's hands. Jasmine shared that she had always sensed something missing. She would have dreams of someone who looked like her, standing just out of reach. Now she realized those dreams weren't imagination. They were memory without context. The body remembers what the mind is told to forget. They both agreed that the worst part wasn't just the abandonment, it was being denied the bond they could have had. 20 birthdays. 20 Christmases. First crushes, first heartbreaks, inside jokes that were never born. The entire foundation of sisterhood had been severed before it even had a chance. And for what? So the Whitmores wouldn't feel uncomfortable at the dinner table? So their neighbors wouldn't whisper? Jasmine said it out loud and felt the anger rise like a tide. Vanessa looked at her and said maybe forgiveness would come someday, but not yet. Right now, it felt too raw, too fresh. Jasmine agreed. Forgiveness wasn't something you could give just because someone finally told the truth. Especially when that truth took 20 years to show up. And especially when it was only offered once the risk of being found out became real. They made a decision that morning. No more waiting for someone else to make things right. If healing was going to happen, it would come from within, from their own choices, their own connection, their own journey forward. They didn't owe the Whitmores a relationship. They didn't owe them closure. What they owed themselves was peace, and peace didn't always come with reconciliation. Later that afternoon, they took a walk through a local park, the kind of place where kids ran through grass and parents sat on benches watching from a distance. Jasmine turned to Vanessa and said it felt strange seeing families like that, whole, together, and wondering what it would have been like if they'd had that too. Vanessa smiled sadly and said maybe they didn't get that kind of beginning, but they could still shape their ending. They stood quietly for a moment, letting the breeze move around them. And then, without saying anything, Jasmine reached out and took her sister's hand. For once, they weren't looking back. They were standing in the middle of now, with all its grief and all its promise, and that was enough. Because the bond they had wasn't something anyone gave them, it was something they had fought to reclaim. And that made it real. A week later, Jasmine and Vanessa stood side by side at the same church steps where one of them had been left 20 years earlier. The stone steps were worn, the wooden door freshly painted, but the air still held a quiet heaviness. It wasn't a pilgrimage. It wasn't even about finding closure. It was simply a way to honor where their story had started, even if no one had told them the truth at the time. They didn't speak much during the visit. They sat for a while on the front steps, letting the hum of passing traffic blend with the sounds of the wind in the trees. It was hard to imagine someone placing a baby here and walking away. But somehow, that moment long ago had created a path. Painful and fractured, yes, but a path that led them to each other. Jasmine thought about how different things could have been. Vanessa thought about how strange it felt to stop wondering and actually know. Their lives weren't magically whole now. There were still questions, wounds, and flashes of resentment that came and went. But the ache that had once felt like a dull emptiness had started to shift. Now, there was connection. A tether that didn't depend on their past being tidy or their parents making amends. It was something they built themselves, conversation by conversation, shared silence by shared silence. They visited the second church later that day. Vanessa said she felt like she owed it to the version of herself that was left there, swaddled in uncertainty. Jasmine understood. They stood in the vestibule for a while, looking at the old wooden pews and the way the light streamed in through stained glass. Neither church had the answers. But both held space for reflection, and that was enough. The following weekend, they met Jasmine's adoptive parents for dinner. Nervous at first, Jasmine had worried how they would react to the news. But her mom had only smiled, eyes glassy with emotion, and said she always believed Jasmine had someone out there. That maybe love didn't always come in neat little family units, but it had a way of finding its way home eventually. Vanessa, touched by the kindness, told them how grateful she was for the love Jasmine had grown up with. They welcomed her with warmth that didn't need history to feel genuine. They decided not to contact the Whitmores again, for now. It wasn't anger holding them back, but something more honest. Face. Time. They needed to live without carrying the weight of anyone else's shame. They needed to explore who they were on their own terms. Not as victims. Not as secrets. But as women who had reclaimed something vital. They started spending weekends together, walking through farmers' markets, watching documentaries late into the night, cooking dishes neither of them really knew how to make. They laughed. They argued. They discovered the small quirks they shared, like how both of them added too much salt when nervous or how they hummed while folding laundry. These tiny, mundane moments became sacred, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. And they were finally shared. One day, sitting on a park bench watching a pair of young twins chase each other through the grass, Jasmine turned to Vanessa and said she used to think the hole inside her would never go away. That no amount of success, friendships, or even love could fill it. But then she met Vanessa, and the ache didn't just shrink, it transformed. It became something she could carry. Not a wound, but a reminder. Of loss, yes. But also of survival. Vanessa smiled and said she felt the same. That for years, she'd thought of family as something she just didn't get to have. But now she had Jasmine. And that was more than she ever expected. Not because they were sisters by blood, but because they chose each other again and again, in all the little moments that made up their days. Their story wasn't the one they were supposed to have. But it was theirs now. Fully, fiercely, and unapologetically. The past hadn't defined them. Fear hadn't defeated them. And abandonment hadn't broken them. In the end, it wasn't biology or forgiveness that made them whole. It was connection. The kind that grows from truth, deepens through time, and becomes unshakable when built on love they created for themselves. Life has a way of leading us through unexpected turns, often without explanation. The story of Jasmine and Vanessa reminds us that truth, no matter how delayed or painful, holds the power to heal. For many older adults who have lived through their own versions of silence, separation, or regret, this story speaks to the importance of reconciliation. Not always with others, but within ourselves. Sometimes, the peace we seek doesn't come from perfect answers or apologies. It comes from choosing connection over resentment, curiosity over bitterness, and compassion over judgment. Jasmine and Vanessa didn't find a perfect ending, but they found something far more lasting, each other. Through that bond, they discovered that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means making peace with it. No matter your age, it's never too late to uncover truth, to forgive at your own pace, and to build something meaningful with the time you still have. Whether it's with family, friends, or even with yourself, choosing love and understanding can turn even the hardest chapters into a story of quiet strength. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your reflections. Have you ever reconnected with someone or uncovered a truth that changed your perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what kind of stories you'd like to see next. Like this video to support more meaningful content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story that could inspire your heart and your life. What would you do if you found out your entire life was built on a lie, and the sister you never knew existed was standing right in front of you? This story is not just shocking, it's personal. It exposes the pain of hidden truths and the strength of unexpected love. Stay with us until the end, because what happens will leave you speechless. If stories like this move you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe right now. We're just getting started. The rain fell gently over the quiet town on the edge of Brigham County, tapping against the windows of the hospital where Jasmine Reed had just started her night shift. She was 20, fresh out of nursing school, and still getting used to the rhythm of the emergency room. Between patients, she checked her phone, half expecting nothing more than a weather alert or a message from her roommate. Instead, what popped up on her screen made her freeze. A notification from the genealogy site she'd joined out of curiosity had just arrived. It said there was a match, a close relative with 50% shared DNA. The label said, possible twin. Jasmine's fingers trembled slightly as she held the phone tighter, her mind racing through every childhood memory she had. She'd always believed she was an only child. Her adoptive parents had told her almost nothing about her biological family, only that she was left at a church one winter night and they were lucky to have found her. Now, this single message cracked open a door she didn't even know existed. She barely had time to process it when the overhead speaker buzzed, calling her to treatment room 2. Her heart still pounding, she slipped the phone into her pocket and hurried down the corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing above her like static. As she stepped into the room, she was met with the sight of a young woman curled slightly on a gurney, wincing in pain. According to the chart, her name was Vanessa Cole, 20 years old, suffering from abdominal cramps that had gotten worse throughout the day. Jasmine moved into nurse mode, calmly introducing herself and checking vitals. But as she leaned in to place her stethoscope, her breath caught in her throat. There was something hauntingly familiar about Vanessa's face. The shape of her eyes, the soft curve of her nose, even a tiny scar near her left eyebrow. Jasmine had seen that exact scar before, every time she looked in the mirror. The resemblance was eerie, and for a split second, the world seemed to tilt. Her thoughts jumped back to the DNA match. Was this possible? Could the girl on the table be the very person the app had just pointed her toward? Trying to maintain her professionalism, Jasmine continued her work, though her mind spun in circles. Vanessa, though in pain, kept glancing at Jasmine too, with the kind of look someone gives when trying to place a face. Jasmine finished the preliminary exam, careful not to let her emotions spill out. She told Vanessa that the doctor would be in shortly and then stepped out into the hallway, her mind caught between disbelief and instinct. She had to know more. Over the next 20 minutes, the ER quieted as the immediate rush passed. Vanessa was placed in a quieter area to rest while awaiting imaging. Jasmine returned to her station, pulled out her phone again, and stared at the DNA message. It was still there. Still real. Still claiming a twin. She found herself walking back toward Vanessa's bed, driven by a pull stronger than logic. They had exchanged only a few words, but Jasmine's heart whispered what her mind wasn't ready to say out loud. As Vanessa rested beneath a thin hospital blanket, her face more relaxed but still pale, Jasmine sat down gently beside her. She didn't know how to start the conversation, or if she even should. But something inside her, the same something that had always wondered why she felt just a little different, a little disconnected growing up, pushed her forward. There was a story here. A shared beginning. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was the night she would finally find out who she really was.